Okay, let's take up a different topic today. Actually, a pair of topics that are historically and conceptually related. The concept from clinical psychology, psychopathology, known as hysteria, and a set of related phenomena known as hypnosis. Hysteria is one of the oldest mental illnesses recorded in medical treatises, though it wasn't always thought of as a mental illness. It is now. Records of hysteria go back to ancient documents in ancient Greece, and this is where they discuss a bunch of syndromes that are found in women and otherwise medically unexplainable, that is, unexplainable to the medicine of 19th century BC Egypt, but because they were found typically in women, were attributed to the uterus and especially to the migration of the uterus. So if the uterus migrated to the woman's throat, then she'd have difficulty talking. If the uterus migrated to the woman's arms, then she'd have difficulty moving and so on and so forth. That was the general idea. And that idea about hysteria lasted for an incredibly long time until the 17th century, when an English physician, Thomas Sydenham, reformulated the idea of hysteria as a group of physical symptoms, paralyses and the like, that were produced by what he considered to be emotional causes. And we have in Sydenham's concept of hysteria the beginnings of the modern concept of a psychosomatic disorder. Further refinement in the 19th century by a French physician, Paul Briquet, who identified a number of patients who had multiple and chronic physical complaints. They'd come to the doctor with one complaint one time, then they'd come to the doctor with another complaint the next time, and it just happened over and over and over and over again. And he could not find any obvious organic basis for these things. There was no peripheral nerve damage, for example, no sign of head injury or anything like that. So again, what we've got here are medical complaints, medical symptoms, if you will, that don't have any obvious physical cause. And we have in Briquet's syndrome, as it came to be known, the roots of the modern concept of somatization disorder. The next big step in the evolution of the concept of hysteria comes with a colleague of Briquet's, Jean-Martin Charcot, another French psychiatrist and neurologist, pioneering French neurologist, in fact, who again identified hysteria as a syndrome whose principal symptoms mimicked various kinds of organic illnesses, but really not just any kind of organic illness. Charcot's view of hysteria was that the symptoms mimicked neurological symptoms of various kinds. So, for example, many hysterical patients presented with tactile anesthesia or analgesia, an inability to feel tactile sensations. They also presented with the difficulties in what are known in medicine as the special senses, primarily vision and hearing. These are patients who couldn't see or couldn't hear what people were saying to them, or problems of motor function, either paralysis in one or more limbs, or problems in speaking, what's known as aphonia. In all of these cases, you have the symptoms of what ordinarily would be considered neurological illness of one sort or another, but no other signs of neurological disease. Nothing wrong with the peripheral nervous system, nothing apparently wrong with the central nervous system either, as far as you could tell. And like Sydenham, like Briquet, Charcot argued that these pseudo-neurological symptoms were produced by high states of emotion or maybe even states of suggestion. And it's for those of you who have taken a course in clinical psychology, Charcot offered a kind of early formulation of what we would now call a diathesis stress theory of mental illness. All diathesis stress theories assert that the patient carries with him or her some kind of underlying predisposition to a mental illness, or to some kind of illness. It doesn't have to be mental illness. But that's not the illness itself. Still, what happens is the person has this predisposition, and then something happens. There's some kind of challenging event or other kind of event in the environment that kind of triggers this process by which the predisposition or vulnerability turns into a full-fledged episode of some kind of illness. Charcot's own version of this was that these patients had a hereditary, so he thought, hereditary constitutional weakness in some part of the nervous system. Didn't show up as a lesion or anything like that. It just wasn't, part of the nervous system just wasn't working right. And then if the person was exposed to some kind of traumatic stress, then the nervous system would essentially break. And where do things break? They break at the weakest link, okay? So you've got this idea that if you're born with a hereditary constitutional weakness in, say, the motor system, and then you're exposed to to high levels of stress, then the nervous system is going to break down in your ability to carry out voluntary motor activities. So, it's also from Charcot that we get this idea of functional lesions in the nervous system. They're not real lesions. Even if a patient should die and you could do an autopsy on the brain, you wouldn't see any evidence of any kind of brain damage. But if there's functional lesions, in that it's as if the patient has a lesion in some part of the nervous system, a lesion that is created by some kind of psychological cause, this exposure to high levels of stress rather than any kind of physical cause like being hit on the head. Just a little bit later, one of Charcot's proteges, Pierre Janet, had produced a more psychological concept of hysteria. Janet was a psychologist as well as a physician, and he identified the principal problem in hysteria as a constriction in awareness, or a constriction in the consciousness, by virtue of which the patient engaged in various kinds of unconscious acts of perception or remembering or voluntary control or whatever. And again, I mean, this idea of Janet's is really quite interesting psychologically. It foreshadows a whole bunch of the concepts that came to the fore in the late 20th century, one of which was what he called the psychological automatism. We've talked about automatic processes earlier in the course. Janet's idea is kind of similar, but he argued that our psychological capacities were organized as a set of automatisms, by which he meant complex responses to various kinds of situations. And we had bundles of these inside our heads, all combining some idea and some emotional response to that idea, and also some motor activity, some action that follows from that idea. And he argued that all of our behavior was governed by what he called these psychological automatisms. If I have the idea that I'm hungry, then I feel bad about being hungry and I go to eat. And they're all kind of wrapped up together, a cognition, an emotion, and a desire, for example, the desire to eat. Janet's idea was that these psychological automatisms were normally accessible to voluntary, to conscious awareness and voluntary control. When I'm hungry, I'm aware of that, and I'm aware of my desire to eat, and I go off and I find a restaurant or open the refrigerator door or whatever. But Janet argued that under certain circumstances, particularly exposure to traumatic levels of stress, various psychological automatisms could be split off from the rest of from the rest of the mind, if you will, and operate outside of conscious awareness and conscious control. So under those circumstances, a person could be hungry but not actually feel hungry, could go off and go to a restaurant or open the refrigerator door or whatever without knowing what he or she was doing or why, because these kinds of behaviors were governed by these psychological automatisms that were split off from the mainstream of consciousness. Janet's term for this splitting off was dissociation, a term that crops up in modern cognitive neuropsychology as well, with much the same meaning. When we say that implicit memory is dissociated from explicit memory, what we mean is that priming effects, for example, have been split off from the person's ability to consciously recall or recognize various kinds of events. Here's an illustration from Janet's treatise on the major symptoms of hysteria, one that he gave pictorial representation to, what he called the case of Irene. Irene was a woman who would every once in a while engage in a kind of somnambulistic behavior, not exactly sleepwalking, but what Janet called somnambulistic behavior. She would go into a kind of trance and reenact the scene in which she found her mother dead in her bedroom. And for Janet's interpretation of this was that the whole element of this scene, the sight of her dead mother in the bedroom, the sound of her voice crying out right before she died, the weight of her mother's body and her own movements while she was carrying her, trying to carry her deceased mother from the bedroom into another room. That had all occurred under a condition of highly stressful, highly traumatic levels of stress, and that psychological automatism had now been split off from the rest of Irene's personality. Here's P, personality, right? All of Irene's conscious faculties. Then there's the sight of the mother, the sound of her voice, the movements made while carrying the body and all that. That's just kind of been split off and is no longer under conscious control and no longer operates under conscious awareness. Irene would engage in these somnambulistic reenactments of the discovery of her mother's dead body and then come out of the somnambulistic episode and have absolutely no memory of what it was that she had done. So again, this kind of primitive, this is not my illustration, it's Janet's from his treatise. This is kind of a way of capturing the essence of this dissociated condition. Another major figure, the only time I talk about him in this course really, in this context is Sigmund Freud, who in fact got interested in hysteria when he was what we would now call a postdoctoral fellow in Charcot's laboratory. Freud was trained as a neurologist. He did pioneering work on aphasia. He also did pioneering work on cocaine. But then he went from Vienna, where he was originally trained, to Paris to work with Charcot, ran into Janet. Freud and Janet became lifelong rivals. It's quite an interesting story. But it was really in Paris, working with Charcot in Charcot's clinic at the Salpêtrière Hospital, that Freud became interested in hysteria, precisely because in hysteria